Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is Emily Steinberg, Director of External Affairs with America's Service Commissions. Today is August 17th, 2020, and this is our monthly communications and marketing learning community call. So thanks everyone for joining us. Looks like we're having great turnout today, so I'm very excited about that. We have lots of exciting things going on today on our call, so I'm really excited for this agenda and for our guest speakers who have joined us here today. So we will kick it off with a little bit of kind of business and reminders, a few things around branding and some requests. And then I'm going to turn it over for the bulk of the call. We'll be hearing from our guest presenters, Dr. Thanira Bailey and Kimberly Wise, on the topic of incorporating DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, into your commission's communication strategies. So I think this is a really important but also layered and nuanced topic. So there's a lot there. We're only going to basically be able to give you, a taste of this topic within this 1 hour. So know that there will hopefully be more offerings from Ask to come in the future, more trainings, more discussions, and incorporating more DEI related discussions into everything we do. But we definitely wanted to think about it from a communications perspective today. So I'm excited that you will be hearing from them for the bulk of today's call. And then, as usual, we'll just kind of round everything out at the end, letting you know about some content themes coming up to think about for your social media and communications calendars. And then I've got a slide with some professional development opportunities that I've updated recently for your consideration as well. And then mark your calendars. Our next call is scheduled for Monday, September 21st, same time, same place. The theme of that one will likely be around the new AmeriCorps branding, given that there will probably be a lot more information coming out about that in the next month. So with that, I'm going to jump in so that we can get through some of our business items. If you haven't already, though, please do just introduce yourself in the chat box, especially for our guests today, so they know who's on the line, your name, title, and which commission or organization you are with. That would be super helpful. So just to kick us off, I did want to kind of briefly recap where we're at with the CNCS AmeriCorps branding initiative, which will basically be rebranding AmeriCorps and key elements of CNCS's work. So I think all of you are fairly aware of these things, but it is our understanding that the new logos, I believe plural, maybe one, we're not totally sure, have been selected by CNCS. And I think a few of you may have even seen a preview on it on a think tank call recently. I believe that what I've heard is that, although I have not seen it myself, is that it will be a new A-looking logo for AmeriCorps, and that it has kind of some elements of like a waving flag embedded in it, although I have not seen it myself. So they will be sharing this on an upcoming call, so hopefully you all have registered for the August 24th call, so basically a week from today. They will be sharing about this. I will put it in the chat box too, so that if you haven't registered, make sure to view this message and get registered. I will just say that personally, and I think organizationally, we are not that excited about all of this. I definitely think there are still some concerns that we have from Ask, and I think many of you share these concerns as well, about the overall new brand architecture and losing some of the important elements of the Volunteer Generation Fund, of commissions, of our state sub-brands and co-brands and program co-brands, and also some potentially concerning messaging and language, and actually some of which touches on the lack of inclusion, which we are going to talk about today. So I think there's a lot there, and I want to make sure that you all are hearing this information firsthand on August 24th. So please do review that message and get registered for that call. Does anybody have any concerns, questions, or intel they would like to share about any of that briefly? Okay, seems unusually quiet, but I know there's just a lot to think about with all of that. So I do understand there's a lot to digest. I did also want to remind all of you that there is a new toolkit that was recently put out by CNCS's Office of Government Relations. I'm really pleased that they did this. I don't think they've done this at least in a very long time, if ever. So this is what we would call an August recess toolkit. And it's essentially an engagement guide for how to engage your elected officials to educate them about your commission, your programs, and the work that National Service is doing in their states and districts. The intent of this is to encourage all of you to think through having some type of August recess engagement strategy. And they've actually included some ideas around socially distant opportunities, which I think are good. I mean, they're simple, but they're good. So that could include, safely organizing a visit for an elected official to a site, could be a food bank or a direct service provider right now that's particularly responding to COVID related needs, but making sure that you're following health guidelines and keeping everyone safe. Alternatively, you could offer for your elected officials to host a Zoom meeting with AmeriCorps members and volunteers. You could record videos highlighting national service projects going on, or even have a social media campaign to educate them or thank them for their support of national service in your state. So all of these are totally allowable. You can absolutely do that, even on federal time, as long as you are not lobbying for a specific thing. All of that is totally allowable. And CNCS has also promised to provide district profiles and data for all of you, if that would be helpful. They actually are quite useful, I would say, and usually fairly up to date and accurate to show all of the national service projects and sites and numbers of national service members in their district. So I'll put that in the chat box as well if any of you would like to download it. I thought it was, simple but good. On a similar note, our friends at Voices for National Service also put out a toolkit related to August recess, but taking a little bit of a different approach, and this would be considered advocacy or lobbying, so please know that I'm sharing this with you as information only and something that you might want to share with your commissioners, volunteers, board members, alumni networks, etc. Or if you want to do this, it's something you could do in your own time. Personally, or not charging time to a federal grant. And that is to write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper or local media sources about the CORE Act in particular, and talking about how, this is really a wonderful bipartisan way that we can come together as a nation and, leverage AmeriCorps, Senior Corps, I would add Volunteer Generation Fund, and commissions to help meet our most critical needs right now during these tough times. So it's very, very simple. Most letters to the editor have to be 150 words or less. So there's not a lot of wiggle room for adding a lot of stuff here, but that keeps it pretty simple. And I definitely think that that's something easy that all of us can do. And in fact, I just found out that a commissioner just got their letter to the editor published in the Houston Chronicle this morning. So that actually went really, really fast because I think she just submitted it probably over the weekend or last Friday. So it's kind of a fun thing you can do. And if you're not comfortable doing lobbying or advocacy, you can also modify this letter to the editor to not make it CORE Act specific, but more generally about national service impact. So keep that in mind too. You could absolutely do this a little bit differently. So I'm going to put that in the chat box as well. So hopefully some of you will take us up on that. And also the goal for that is to do that, to submit it no later than the 21st of August. I believe that is, I should check this out, Friday. So basically by this Friday to have those submitted. And the reason is that when Congress does come back from their August recess, we want there to be a buzz about national service, and we really want to kind of keep the conversation moving while they're on recess so that they see the urgency and the popularity of national service in their home states. So any questions about any of that? Okay. Last but not least, a special request, and I did just post this on Basecamp, so sorry for following up again, but I am looking for B-roll video from any commissions or AmeriCorps State or Volunteer Generation Fund programs that just show kind of that background video footage of, people out there serving, people coming together, anything that's been going on, particularly if it's recent or even during kind of the COVID-19 period of time, showing people serving safely, showing people wearing masks and doing volunteer work, preferably with, national service gear or logos involved, but, it could be your commission staff doing a project together. So I know I've been collecting photos, but I'm going to, increase my request to also video, and we're looking for this to possibly put together some short video reels for our upcoming virtual awards reception, which will be held on September 24th. So I need this really, really soon, but you all might have something available or have seen something on social media. Even if you're not sure if it's not yours, but you think we could maybe contact the person who posted it to get permission, that would be fine too. So that would be super helpful if you can think of or find any B-roll that's been relatively recent. So I think, one last thing, just a couple of reminders that there is an upcoming awards nomination deadline for 1 in a Million. And they are looking for acts of kindness and COVID relief efforts by August 31st. Points of Light is also doing something very similar that I forgot to put on the slide, but for the George H.W. Bush program that they're doing in September. So there's a couple of different awards nomination open right now. Particularly, these would be great for nominating AmeriCorps members or program directors or leaders, could be commission staff or leaders as well, for just doing outstanding work related to COVID-19 relief. So I hope all of you have deadlines in mind and make sure that we're helping showcase the great work that your programs are doing. So with that, I'll see if there's any last questions before we turn it over to our guests. Okay, going once, going twice. All right. Well, then I am very excited to introduce our special speakers of the month on a very important topic. I'm really pleased that we were able to arrange some time on their calendars to hear from Dr. Thanera Bailey, who is the president and CEO of the CISCI Group, and Kimberly Wise of the Wise Health Communications Group as well, both of whom have a lot of experience in DEI, but also I think just in nonprofits and social justice in general. So just briefly a little bit about them. Thanera is president and CEO of the CISCI Group, and she has an accomplished career as a trainer, consultant, nonprofit leader, grant maker, and technical assistance provider to nonprofits, programs, government agencies, corporations, and school systems across the country. She's worked as a strategy consultant, including for clients such as the American Heart Association, the New Mexico Department of Workforce Solutions, AARP Foundation, America's Service Commissions, obviously, CNCS, and many others. So we are actually working with Thanera right now with ASC to help us improve our inclusion efforts as well. And it's been a huge pleasure and privilege to get to work with her and learn from her. And then new to our network, I would say, is Kimberly Wise. So we're excited to have Kimberly join us as well. She's based in the Dallas area and has nearly 20 years of experience working with healthcare associations, nonprofits, medical centers, federal and state government agencies, and others, and focuses a lot on important health issues such as obesity, childhood asthma, nutrition, diabetes, cancer, and other things. And she really has a lot of experience with things like strategic planning, media relations, crisis communications, and conflict resolution. So they both have very accomplished long bios. That's my very short attempt to try to tell you a bit about them. But I will let them introduce themselves and kick us off while I pull up their slides. So I'll kick it off to you, Thanera and Kimberly.
Hey, good morning, afternoon.
Go ahead, Thanera.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's good to see some names that I'm familiar with in the list of attendees, and looking forward to having this conversation with those of you that I haven't met. Just As Emily said, I'm the president and CEO of the SISG Group, and we're really excited to see so many commissions and organizations taking this DEI work and thinking about how to increase their communications to be more inclusive very seriously. And so it's a pleasure to share with you. We have a ton of resources and information. I know that for some of you, this might be redundant or things you've been exposed to. So we're kind of trying to hit everybody in the information. But if there are questions that we don't get to, we'll share our information at the end. And we also encourage you to put questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them also. And I'll kind of switch off to you, Kim, to introduce yourself and to get us started.
Sure. So thank y'all for welcoming me into the fold. As Vanessa mentioned, my name is Kimberly Wise. I am the founder of Wise Health Communications. And actually, I also sit on the board of SISG, and Sanera and I have known each other longer than we have not known each other. And so I was very, very excited to be, brought into this opportunity because it's one that, as you can imagine, is near and dear to our hearts. I want to thank y'all for the time today and just having open minds. I have to say that more excited, I was very excited for this call, but even more excited when I found out that it is not a video call because my eyes do not shine as brightly as they did in this headshot. And so I am glad that the image on the screen is the image you'll have of me versus my post-COVID self. So anyway, as Emily mentioned a few minutes ago, this topic is just very, very nuanced. And, in addition to COVID kind of making us all stand still, one of the, I think, bright spots of this all has been kind of the emergence of the importance of kind of diversity and inclusion, and just people being, open to understanding how it might impact them from a business perspective, in addition to whatever they're doing personally. And so while it is a nuanced topic, it is absolutely one of the most important ones that you'll take on as you look to ensure your programs and your communications are really as impactful as you hope they would be. So Emily, I'll go to the next slide. That's perfect. So from a communications perspective, like I just said, diversity and inclusion, it is a priority and it's a challenge. And of course, in addition to it just being legally the right thing to do, morally the right thing to do, it actually does lead to more successful, profitable organizations, happier employees. And I know today the one thing that we'll want to focus on is really the very critical role that it has to play, that the critical role of communications in this kind of furthering the diversity and inclusion objectives in your organization. I'll go to the next slide. So the next slide, here are a few important things. And we'll go through more of this and we'll give you some tips and examples, but we'll just kind of 30,000 foot view it right now. But when you're approaching this work, when you're even thinking about it, starting to plan, or even really getting it in your mind that this is something that's important, it's very, very important to make sure that any effort, whether it is from, you writing an email, sharing, presentations, or making some of the bigger changes that you need to, and maybe some of your organizational structure, whatever you do is very important that you make it relatable and authentic to not undermine your commitment. And if you read that to say no box checking, because just know that the folks whose ears it falls on, who this is their everyday lived experience, those people can tell when something is authentic and when it is being done as following on to some other effort, or if it's not being done with the right, kind of intention and inspiration. So the second thing is just ensure that everything is communicated correctly and genuinely. That goes back to what I said before. It doesn't take but a few minutes to just stop, check yourself, making sure that, things are right, because that is kind of the first, way to turn people off, is if they see something that is easily checkable, but that it's incorrect. But I think the important thing here is that, ultimately, if this is your first kind of step in this direction, it's important to take the step, but just making sure that things are correct and genuine. And then also tell the stories that resonate with your audiences and lean into their experiences. So this might be if there's a particular communication you're used to sending out regularly, that you think, maybe there's an opportunity to give it someone else's voice, because nothing goes further than stories and testimonials and people feeling seen. And so that could be, a very important piece of the puzzle when you step into this space. I'll go to the next slide. Perfect. So as we mentioned, this can be uncomfortable, and it could be, we're all on this call and we have, some, professional experience in our areas. And so I know that we know everything in our area, but this is one of those times where you say, that the minute you stop learning is the minute you die. I think this is the important thing. If you haven't learned anything at work in years, this is an important thing to start to learn and dive into as much as you can. And of course, it will require just this kind of culture shift. It'll require a difference in the way that you're operating as organizations. It will require a mind shift. And one of the things, I actually had a similar talk with an organization a few weeks ago. And the one thing that I thought was important to say is that in this space, we all grew up the way we grew up. We all grew up believing the things we believe. If you're wanting to push yourself personally to change, having a personal mind shift in terms of, changing some of your personal beliefs, I think that's important. But, a mind shift and a culture shift is definitely important when we step into our organizations or when we come to work. And so just be ready to do kind of the hard work of that when you're within, and I would say within walls, but none of us are within any walls but our homes maybe these days, but just making sure that you're open to that type of shift professionally. I'll go to the next slide. Perfect. So here's the other thing. Do not let this topic or, the fact that we need to take a step in this direction, don't let it paralyze you. Don't let it freak you out. And it really is progress over perfection. I say that because, if we could literally whiteboard all the things that could go wrong, you wouldn't do anything. And so I think it's important to take your best intention, say, hey, if you've done all the things, and we'll go through some checklists and some other things that you can do to give, your best kind of effort. But if you've done all of those things, if you have, if your intention is right, if everything is right and you still make a mistake, that's okay. It's actually normal because, even when we're not tackling topics as tough as this one, we make mistakes as professionals, as people, So the important thing with those kind of things is just making sure that you have something that is, in place to make sure that if you do make a mistake, you can easily recover, or at least quickly recover, because I think sometimes that's what happens when you do have, if you've made a mistake, but you take too long to kind of clean it up, or you take too long to address it. And so you can think of things like, policies and statements to kind of respond quickly, and just showing ownership of the mistake. And I think just kind of, laying yourself bare that this is something that your organization is passionate about, you think is important, but you made a misstep, clean it up and keep moving. Don't let that, deter you from this space or run you away, because like we said, it is truly one of the most important things, and it really is the judge these days of whether or not you're being impactful or not. Okay, next slide. I will turn it over now to Samira, who will take us through this next section.
Thanks, Kim. So I do want to just provide some content to what we're going to be sharing. We're going to share things in kind of 3 pots, things that you can do now, meaning the minute you get off this phone, this is something you can implement, things that you can do soon within the next year, and then this long-term investment in strategy. I think the most important thing to recognize is that issues like racism, gender discrimination, disability discrimination have been embedded in our society and in our organizations. So you can't just have a desire to make change and immediately it happens. These are things that are going to take your team, your organization, maybe years to get to the point where you're really implementing this without any challenges or any concerns. And so if you own the fact that this is a long journey, not a short, quick sprint, you'll be more successful. The other thing I want to share is that I don't necessarily always share our slides. We have workshop notes that we will share, and Emily will make sure that you get, so that we'll provide the detail beyond the slides, some resources and some additional information. Doesn't mean you shouldn't take notes or can't ask questions, but it'll provide more depth to the content that we shared today, because we're going to cover quite a bit in this short period of time and a lot of detail, especially in this next session. So just wanted to provide that. So things you can do now, the first steps that you should take, like I said, the minute you get off this call, these are the things that you can do. So every organization should have a guiding statement. This is something that related to justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. You'll hear us talk throughout this conversation about JEDI, JEDI mindset, JEDI thinking. JEDI is justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. Every organization should have a guiding basic statement that the company uses to inform all your communications. If you do this, it gives you a good starting point. People can use it as a check for how they're thinking through things and developing best practices. It helps people who maybe in their gut haven't gotten to that place where they understand how to make inclusive documents or how to create communications that looks at things with a JEDI lens. That guiding statement provides that foundation. And it should include goals, things that you want your communications to achieve, and then examples for clarification. Our website should have X. Our statements will do these types of things. On the next slide, you'll see an example of a starting point for a JEDI-centric communication. So you see here that it defines communications and marketing materials, and that they should reflect the diversity, equity, and inclusion. For you all, I might say the diversity, equity, and inclusion of the state, the community that you're representing. And I'll talk a little bit more later about why defining that is really important. And then it goes into more detail about what that actually means. So it includes people of all ethnicities, gender, sexual orientations, religious affiliations. We've all seen the list of different maybe discrimination policies might have. Great place to kind of steal that language and include it. And then this part I think is really important, that it makes no assumptions about the receiver of the communications, and that you're not building on stereotypes or other things within your communications. And so you use this statement as a starting point for everything, and it should guide your work. I think this is true even outside of communications. All organizations should have some of these kind of guiding principles around JEDI, because it gives you a place to start. You know where you stand, you know where the line is in the sand, and where you can go from there. Next slide. The other really key important thing is language. All communications is built on the way that you talk and think about organizations, the way you talk and think about others. And so language, of course, would be your starting point. Next slide. You'll see here that we have the definition of what it means, what inclusive language is. So it's visual or verbal communication that does not stereotype or demean people based on these characteristics. And again, that it's important to think about not stereotyping or demeaning people. So there's definite ways that you can talk about people or community groups. There's things that fall into stereotypes that you want to avoid, and that can be with images. I see a lot of organizations that make the mistake of constantly using maybe a young person of color with a white volunteer every single time. And so when you think about inclusive, how are you representing the opposite? That people of color are not always recipients of service, and people who are white or white passing are not always seen as providers of service. And so language can be, again, that visual language and things that people accept through just seeing, or it can be something that you're communicating with words and text. Next slide. So the starting point, typically in the United States, we tend to think about race and ethnicity. It's a big part of our identity because we have people from all over, and we've gone through several terms for what we talk about for non-white individuals in our country. So you've heard minorities, you might have heard oppressed groups, underrepresented groups. Typically right now we're seeing BIPOC often used, and that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. This is a term that can be used most often when you're talking about non-white individuals in the United States. It's not necessarily going to work if you're talking about people outside of the United States, and it's better than just the term people of color, or to use Black when you're really meaning, or using people of color when you're really meaning Black, or not including Indigenous communities as a separate racial group compared to others. So this is a good way, instead of using minorities or minority groups, to use BIPOC. Next slide. Some other things to think about with race and ethnicity. You can use BIPOC. You can also use historically underrepresented groups. That is definitely better than minority or minorities. The big part about why we don't use minority anymore is it's just not statistically right. Many communities, people of color are the majority. And so using minority does not relate to that demographic. So my suggestion is actually that you try your best to use the specific racial and ethnic groups. So if you are talking about a particular neighborhood or a particular person, you can ask, what is your ethnic background? And it might be Puerto Rican American, Dominican American, Russian American, whatever that might be is usually the best way to talk about race. If you can't do that, then I've listed a few others and another ways to think about them. In the United States, we often interchange Black and African American, but it's important to recognize that not all people who are Black consider themselves or identify as African American. And that is typically people who come from the Caribbean, African nations, or who might be Black and Latino. And so using the term Black with a capital B is often preferred to even using African American. And I know often people kind of hesitate with using Black. So you can, if you feel more comfortable, use African American, but do recognize that you might be isolating some people from identifying. Another term that is often only used in the United States is Hispanic, meaning anyone from a region or country that has a Spanish-speaking background. What is more common to use is Latino, Latina, or Latinx, which is an ungendered alternative to Latino or Latina. And so using that tends to be a better identifier than Hispanic, but you can use Hispanic, Latinx together. Asian American and Pacific Islander is a very large group, and also includes people from the Middle East, from the Asian Pacific areas. And so sometimes breaking it down into smaller groups can make it easier. Again, this is where ethnicity can help to play a part. Saying someone is Vietnamese or Indian American is much more detailed than the larger pot of Asian American and Pacific Islander. I think one thing that is really important for organizations that are working for inclusive language, particularly as you represent a state, is to recognize the Indigenous people who were in this area before it became the United States. It's important that you learn the tribes and the tribal lands that are associated with the cities and the communities that you represent, that you begin to understand how to describe and talk about those tribes, and recognizing that you have settler privilege when you discuss them. And so if Indigenous communities really do require a little more research. They're very specific to your community. Every state has different groups that might be identified with it. So I'd hate to just put a label throughout. And so I do suggest that you take the time to figure out who are the tribes and communities that are local to your state or your community. Next slide.
Danara, let me just take a moment to mute some lines.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little bit of background noise, so let me just take care of this and then I'll unmute you shortly.
Okay.
Okay, you should be unmuted now.
Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Just put something in the chat if you can hear, like exclamation points. That'd be great. All right, so that's race and ethnicity. I'm not going to add any more details in that, but if you have a specific question about language related to race and ethnicity, please feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll be happy to try to answer that in the questions. So the next area for inclusive language, we're going to talk about gender and sexual orientation. I love this genderbread person, because for people who don't know the correct terms, are confused about the difference between gender, orientation, and sex, this provides a really clear way to figure that out and how to determine the appropriate use of the terms. And so when we're talking about gender, we're talking about male, female, or gender queer. You also might see non-binary sometimes with that. With orientation, we're talking about people who are attracted and fall in love with women, people who fall in love and are attracted to male, and people who fall in love and are attracted to both genders, or people who both ends of the spectrum. For sex, we're talking about actual biology in that space. So you have people who might have male genitalia and someone who might have female, or you might have someone who's intersex. And then for gender expression, it's, again, another spectrum. You have people who identify and express more in a masculine way, and people who identify and express in a feminine way, and people who are androgynous. And so if you think about this in this way, it adds layers. It adds much more than just saying man or woman or gay or straight. There's a lot more that you should be thinking about, or may not be appropriate at all. I think a very simple and easy place to start is around preferred pronouns. Always making sure that you ask the question, never making an assumption based upon how someone presents, because someone may present feminine but identify male in their gender. That is completely normal. And so you want to be able to make sure that someone's pronouns are there, have been indicated to you before you write or communicate, particularly in situations where you might be interviewing someone or people might ask questions of that person. You don't want them using an incorrect pronoun when interacting with that individual. As much as possible, try to use gender neutral terms. Instead of chairman, it's chairperson. Instead of thinking of the workforce, or it might be instead of manpower, thinking around places where you attach a gender to a role or an identity. As much as possible, try to use gender neutral. If you're uncertain, if the person has not indicated, or the person has indicated their preferred pronouns are they, them, or their, they should be used. It is AP guidelines. You're fine to do them, and it should be included as much as possible. I think it's also key that you shouldn't mention gender or race or anything else unless it's necessary to do so. Avoiding labels is always important. And when it comes to orientation, the LGBTQIA or LGBTQ+ is more inclusive than just saying LGBT. As you see from our genderbread person, you're missing quite a few individuals if you stop at LGBT. And LGBTQIA is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual. And so it allows for more people to be included. Of course, with Q+, you are leaving out intersex and asexual. So it's your decision where you go, but of course you want to think about trying as much as possible to include as many people as possible. All right, next slide. So just a few more considerations around language. I know something, I've worked my entire career in the nonprofit sector, predominantly in youth-based organizations. And so for years, we would label kids as at risk. Our programs were designed for at-risk youth. It was a way to indicate that you were working with a population in need. And over time, the research has shown that has not been an effective way to label young people, and actually gives you the reverse circumstances. So in the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of organizations trying their best to kind of turn a negative into a positive. Now it's at promise, or we're not working with at-risk youth, we're working with at, I can't think of, it's an A word, but you don't want to do that either. In some ways, it seems almost like you're not saying at risk, but you're just making it into something else. And so my suggestion is to use data and to be specific about the young people that you're working with. So instead of saying that they're at-risk youth, say what they're at risk of. So we are working with young people in a community that is high poverty, and the young people in this community are at risk of increased engagement with crime. At risk is so broad and can include so many things. And many of us, when we were going through our teen years, were at risk of something. Maybe we were at risk of becoming a parent young. Maybe we were at risk of including or using drugs or substances. We were at risk of failing out of the 9th grade. Whatever that at risk might be, saying that is too broad. And so always try your best to use specific data and be specific about what exactly you're trying to do. The other thing is you can just forget all the labels and just talk about students and what you're providing. So we are providing more resources to students to support success for all students, or for all individuals in our schools. As much as possible, you want to normalize pronoun use. And so at the beginning of the conversation, I was trying to get my pronouns in the chat and figure out how to do it. I'm on the browser, so you don't see that, but I use she, her, and hers pronouns. But simply for things like this, and all your Zoom calls, having everybody change their pronouns, so nobody has to advocate or ask for themselves. Everybody's normalized in that. If you're having live events, using the labels or the ribbons at the end of the name tag. All of those things can be really helpful. And I think one of the things, and these two go in hand between census data and tokenism. As when I was going to college, I remember receiving college brochures, and every single one had their nice group of multiracial individuals and a person in a wheelchair to represent the wonderful diversity on campus. The fact is, though, when I went to predominantly white institutions, the number of students who looked like me was minimal. And so if I looked at the brochure, you would think that there were, 50% students of color, when that is not the truth. What tends to happen in programs and organizations is we tokenize the 1 or 2 Black or Asian or students with a disability in our publications to show that we care about inclusion or diversity. I think that can be really harmful and is not authentic. And as much as we want, Kim said in the beginning, you want to remember, people recognize that when they're looking at your materials and your information. I think communities should look at their census data. As a state-based or community-based organization, you can get the demographics for your state. So if you are a largely Latino organization or state, you should have that representation in your publications, in your communications, in your images. If you have a large indigenous community and a particular tribe, you want to make sure that's represented. The same can be true with other aspects of diversity. It's important to avoid that tokenism where you're highlighting things just to show that you have a diverse lens. And then I think another challenge of the nonprofit sector is in our efforts to try to show the need, we sometimes remove voices and agency from the communities that we serve. So you want to focus on amplifying voices and their representation. Be careful about single stories, this one-dimensional view of the experiences of people and communities, particularly those who are under-resourced and underrepresented, and that you are a partner in the work that you're doing in these communities instead of a savior. So as much as possible, trying your best to make sure that you're including people, but that you're not pretending or performing that you're inclusive, but that you're being as authentic as possible. I'm going to turn it over to Kim to talk through some things that are specific to your communications.
Kim, oh, I'm sorry, let me unmute you. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Hey there, y'all, I'm back. So thank you so much for that, Sanera. We'll just go through these next slides pretty quickly because it is really all, you know, we're walking towards the light from here on, and just how you can kind of implement these things. So here's just a quick little kind of communications checklist that we pulled together. You know, that maybe if you're doing something big or even small, you can kind of pull this out as a kind of a beginner to make sure that there are some boxes you've checked. The first one is have I checked for bias? So of course, that's through some of the inclusive language that Sanera mentioned, some of the naming of the different groups, you know, some of the other watch outs that she mentioned. You can also ask yourself, does this reflect the community and the population that I'm serving? I love the example of, you know, at risk versus, you know, other students with opportunities or whatever that you'll decide makes sense there. You know, so I love that thought there. Does this follow our values and statements? And so this goes back a lot to the, you know, does this go with our organization? Are we being authentic? You know, is this really kind of in line with the way that we've engaged with our groups before? Have I run this by the Inclusion Jedi group? And we'll talk a little bit more about like kind of a broader group there, but have you run this by someone else who might have a different lens on this topic, or even someone just to be a second pair of eyes who might catch things that are important to include? The last one is, am I speaking for someone rather than amplifying their voice? And so that goes to what Sanera was saying a few minutes ago. Okay, next slide. And so here are a couple more things about running a bias check on all your comms, like, you know, checking the pronouns, you know, are the he, she there, the racial ethnic role models, are they used in a non-stereotyped way? You know, are people referenced first, as in people with diabetes, or have the labels or conditions been used inappropriately as nouns to describe a group like diabetics? You know, does someone on our team already know, or do we need to ask which term is referred or preferred for such national origins? And just making sure, again, like I said, that there is someone there who, you know, since, you know, you're going through this kind of small training or intro training, maybe you can be that person, but just making sure there's someone there with an eye to this topic. Go to the next slide. We'll go to the next slide. Yep, so as Sanera mentioned, we really did this in 3 buckets. The first bucket, like you said, things that like as soon as you hang up, you're off to the races. These things are the things to do soon, which is, you know, create within the next, you know, 6 months to a year. We'll go to the next slide. One thought that we had was just, you know, after this, you're already kind of thinking in this space, you're putting together your, you know, kind of justice statement, et cetera. You might want to pull together a focus group, you know, that just helps you kind of get that value statement and just making it sure it's specific to your community. And that could be pulling in some local folks, or, you know, pulling in some stakeholders, or pulling in other folks from other regions who have done it and are doing it, just to kind of inform that process for you. But that could be something that you can do to kind of nail that down, so that that's the kind of statement and mantra that your organization is starting to live by. And that's where you see those kind of cultural shifts. One thing that I've done in a few organizations is just created like a bank of templated materials. You know, so if there are particular newsletters that you're putting out, or, you know, email templates, or even if you want to gather some images that, you know, are kind of, you know, appropriate for, you know, this moment, or that, you know, hit all the right tones and notes in terms of diversity, putting that all in a place where, you know, if someone is tasked with a communication, that they're not scrambling or they're not kind of, you know, recreating the wheel every time or even making judgment calls on their own about what checks, you know, all the kind of boxes that we had on that communications checklist, but that you're providing them with those. The next thing is just looking at your externally facing, you know, kind of properties or communications, whether it's social media channels or websites, just making sure all those things are reflective of the community and fully accessible for people with disabilities. And we'll go a little bit into a couple of tools for that in next. Another thing is just stand by statements. In the event you make mistakes, I mentioned that up top. And this is, you know, a lot of your comms professionals or marketing professionals, but it could be something pretty short and sweet, and just making sure that those standby statements are not defensive, you know, that they really are addressing the issue, that it isn't blaming anyone else, that it's really taking the appropriate accountability if that's necessary. And then also just an inclusion brand guideline. So this really goes to what I was saying in terms of, you know, even if it's a one pager where you give people some of these tips and you know, give them examples of what to say, what not to say. And the start of that can be from this presentation. Like Danira said, we'll give you our information at the end and we can work together with you as you pull some of that stuff together. Next slide. So this slide, this is just making sure that you're working with your local disability association, like best practices and resources in your community, because a lot of times we might be doing, you know, something, but then ultimately we think we're making accommodations, but maybe we have not completely, you know, made those things accessible to everyone, specifically our disabled population of stakeholders. You know, that maybe there is something, and I just mentioned this a few minutes ago, a few seconds ago about, you know, our websites and that sort of thing. But I know our local disability associations, they can really kind of provide information on, you know, venues that are most accessible, provide you with, you know, interpreters for event, review materials for a variety of disabilities, and just making sure that, you know, your current technology and resources really do accommodate. AskJan.org is an online resource that you can quickly find best practices for accommodations. Next slide, please. Here are a couple websites, Wave and Lighthouse, and they will let you literally put your URL for your website into them, and it will tell you all the kind of blind spots that you might have, that if there is a particular place in your website where, you know, maybe the text is too small. So for people with kind of visual disabilities, that might not, you know, necessarily make your website accessible. It can tell you, you know, if there are different places where you need to shore up, you know, other areas. That will just make sure that from a disabilities perspective, that your websites, your blogs, and your online platforms are accessible to these groups. And then the World Wide Web Consortium, it maintains an extensive list of web accessibility evaluation tools. So these are two, and then you can go to w3.org to see if there are others that will just kind of allow you to be able to make sure that everything is more accessible. And I believe these next slides I will turn over to Sanera. Nope,
all right,
those are my slides.
Go ahead, Kim.
I think I actually presented your slides.
It's fine. We're in that last section anyway, so either way.
I hope you're proud of me. Sorry, the last section. It's funny, we were practicing, and I was like, no, there. I'm way more comfortable. You present those slides, and now here I am, and I blew right past you. So sorry about that. So the last section is just the long-term investment. And, you know, that true inclusion really requires that long-term, deep culture change, mind shift change, and all of that, you know, all of that good, you know, warm and fuzzy stuff. So next slide, please. So again, the culture changes when all your staff is trained in this area. And again, these are things that it'll take a little while, right? But if you're steadily doing these baby steps, and you're baby stepping up to this bigger kind of, you know, cultural shift, We think that's the way to go. Like we mentioned, progress over perfection. But at this stage, it's more perfection, right? Because you've been, doing your focus groups, making sure that, your materials are saying the right things, hitting the right tone. You're, incorporating, kind of feedback across the organization to make sure that you're being authentic and all of that. So this stage is a little bit closer to perfection than the earlier stages. This is also a stage where you're leading with inclusion and anti-racism. You have inclusion committees with local stakeholders, where you're tapping into areas, you might even be doing some sort of evaluation of your efforts at this point as well, whether that's, internally at your organization, just getting feedback from people to see how you're doing, or it might be from some of your stakeholders too, like how are we doing, is this hitting right, et cetera, and maybe you'll be reshifting some of what you're doing. And then the last thing is just a mission and values guide. Your mission and values guide your view towards justice. And that's, like we said, that's when, you're having your staff to really be talking in this way, whether it's, a change of, even a different way that you look at your constituents, like all of those great things are like, it's ingrained in your organization through and through. So that's it. Or I guess the next one is no one size fits all. And so make sure that you follow up with us for any specific strategies for your community or your organization. And the next slide, questions. And our contact information is there. So I will shut up now and allow for any questions. I see a lot of stuff over here on the chat boxes. I do see someone put, do you have examples of stand-by statements? And I can definitely get, a couple of those to you all.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I will unmute lines. So if you don't want to be heard, please do put yourself on mute, but I will open all the lines in case there are any questions. Did anyone want to ask a question of Thanera or Kim? Well, was there a question?
Hey, Gary here. No question, but I just wanted to say thank you. That was really informative and some great links in there that I'll be able to take back to my commission. So thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. And like I said, we do have the workshop notes. Everything we both said very quickly is in detail in the workshop notes, along with the links like to WAVE and Lighthouse or to other resources. So please also share that with your staff. And we're happy to help where we can.
Any other questions? Getting some more praise in the chat box. I will just say, first of all, thank you so much, Thanera and Kimberly, for your time today. I know when I first asked Thanera to join, I think in my mind, I very problematically thought, oh, like we could get some checklists or some to-do items, and wasn't thinking about how much of a long-term investment this is. And so there is just so much more to think about. And I know this is something, an ask that we are trying to begin thinking about and investing in, over the next, few years, in particular with our new strategic plan. So I hope all of you will take that away as well. There's no 10 item checklist that we can do. This is a longer process, but something we can work towards. So thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for reiterating
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say something really quickly if, at all this matters. But one of the things that, you see everything is swirling these days, and people talk about being exhausted, just think about it from this standpoint. Or if you are not typically one of the groups that are impacted, or that, this doesn't necessarily pertain to, and I feel like there's probably not very many people, but, just think about that this is like the lived experience of the folks who you're working with, whether it's poverty, whether it's, racism, whether it's homophobia, or, the host of other different things. And so just think that, we've been kind of living these lives for so many years, like your help, your interest, your commitment, and not just flash in the pan commitment, but long-term commitment is more life-giving than you'll ever realize. And so, know that if you start, it's a long road, but you have lots and lots and lots of people who have been waiting for this kind of partnership with others. And so just know that it's so important and it's so welcome and will be well received by all. So that's just the last thing I'll say there.
Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. I know we're at time, so we will let you go, but people do have your contact information, and I will make sure to share all of this as well as the notes from today's call that Thanera shared with me to give to all of you. So looking forward to continuing this conversation in other ways. In closing, I'll post this on Basecamp as well, but I did just want to remind you all that there's a lot of opportunities actually to incorporate, JEDI and DEI into your upcoming monthly content for social media or newsletters. There's a lot of things going on in September that might be interesting and, celebrating different communities, whether it's kind of back to school stuff or it's actually National Historically Black Colleges and Universities Week, second week of September. We have International Week of the Deaf coming up. Good Neighbor Day. There's just so many opportunities to build this into your work. So I will share that on Basecamp. And then I will also post this, but there's a number of upcoming professional development opportunities related to communications and marketing. And most of them have now gone virtual. So that's great because it makes it even more accessible for all of us who are stuck at home and would like some training and professional development. So I'll share this as well, but there's just a lot of good stuff being developed right now. And our next call will be Monday, September 21st. I will get back to you on the topic, but it will likely have to do with the CNCS branding, new branding, and kind of debriefing about all of that, whatever we learn in the next few weeks. So thank you all for your time today. Have a great rest of your Monday. And again, huge thanks to Thanera and Kimberly for their time and their wisdom today. So really appreciate it, y'all. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.